Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a designer animator at Imaginary Forces New York, and I want to give a big shout out for Maxon to bring me out to Siggraph again so I could show you guys some awesome stuff. And boy oh boy, do we have a lot of crazy stuff to look at today.
Welcome. Remember to keep an eye on any valuables you may have brought with you. In case of emergency, watch your step as you walk to the nearest exit and move a safe distance away. And if you spot any suspicious behavior or characters, please report them to our crew. Now, welcome to Dolby Cinema at AMC Prime. Coming soon to AMC. One last thing. Talking or using your device during the film is distracting. Don't ruin the movie.
All right, so first thing, let's build our Xparticle system. Let's go to emitter, and let's create a brand new emitter. And what we want to do from there is that we want to change the emitter shape to object, and we have to think about this conceptually as well. We want to start cloning particles onto this bird. So we're going to change the emitter shape to object, and then we're going to drag our eagle into the object shape, and then we want it to emit from the polygon area. So it's just a little bit more random. And also you want to go to emission. You want to take out all speed so it doesn't fly off the object. Put this to 0. So now when we hit play, it grows on. But right now it's continuously growing on. That's not quite what we want. So we go back to Xparticle emitter. We unselect emit all frames, and then let's do 15. So it only emits for 15 frames, and they just stay there. Cool. So now we're going to create some modifiers because we want to move these particles on this bird. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a motion modifier called follow surface, and then we're going to create another modifier called turbulence. And I'll explain exactly what this does. So for the follow surface, this follow surface basically tells Xparticles, stick these particles onto a piece of geometry, which you're going to use as this eagle. And what this turbulence is doing is giving turbulence animation to these particles. So now that I hit play, you can see these particles turbulently moving on the surface of the bird. This is starting to look like what we want. So I'm going to turn down the scale of this turbulence so that we get, so the particles don't move as uniformly. They kind of move around the bird. And then I'm going to turn down the strength of this to maybe like 2.5 so it doesn't feel as crazy. And also you can see they're kind of moving above the bird. We want them to be a little bit closer to the geometry. So I'm going to make the radius 0.5. Let's resim that. All right, a little bit closer. So maybe I'll just do like 0.1. All right, that's looking better. So now that we have our particles moving, we can create some generators. And we're going to create, let's click generator, choose generator. We're going to create some trails. And a trail allows you to select an emitter. And let's hit play. Ooh, now we have some lines going. This thing is coming alive. But what this does, it's just creating lines throughout the entire animation. We don't want that. So we want to jump in, turn off full scene trail, and then we could determine how we want to control the length of it. I like doing length. So I think something like, let's say 10 centimeters is good. And having some variation is always nice. So I'm going to add some variation to this thing as well. Let's sim that back. So that's step one. Now we already have this, pretty cool, lively type thing going. I think it gets a little bit crazy at the end, so I'm going to bring this down to 7, maybe turn down our turbulence to a 2. And that's basically how we did. We just jump back into the previs, R&D. So on this thing, there's actually 2 different simulations. There's one with straighter lines, and then there's one with curlier lines. So what I did to get the curlier lines, I could simply just jump in and change the mode to, not the mode, but the noise type to curl. And then once we do that, you can see that we have this really nice organic kind of swirly turbulence going on. So that's step 1, right? We're building these lines. But how do we render this? Here. So what we want to do, we're going to right-click on this trail. Want to select hair and hair render. And then you want to go to create shader hair material. Just drag it on our trail. Hit that. Then we start seeing stuff happening, but it doesn't look anything like what we want. So let me just make a new material to put on this bird. Right, make that black, turn off reflectance. Take a look at it again. So now let's jump into this hair material and start changing some of these properties. All right, I'm going to change the color to a nice orange, something that feels very, alive and vibrant. I think that looks good. Then make this one bright on the edge. All right, that looks like it. But I think the most important part is this curve in the thickness parameter. And this is how I usually set it up. If you hit Command, you drag down, and you make a really nice dynamic curve. And what we're trying to do is get like these kind of energy tips on the ends of our moving particles here. This is beginning to look more like it, right? So this is more or less how we do this type of swirling animation. And if you go back to our my first R&D test, I was like, okay, this is beginning to look good. It's a combination of like 2 sims of these, some other particles, some other Fresnel shaders. I'll kind of show how I built these up a little bit later. But this presented another problem. This bird has to move. How am I getting this sim to work with a flapping bird? Okay, and that's when I had to be a little bit innovative. So I built a rig. I built a rig for this bird out of deformers. And I animated it, all just kind of using MoGraph. Not MoGraph, but deformers. So if I click down, these are my long list of deformers that I used, and then I used Espresso to kind of connect them all together. I've gone through this technique a couple times in last Siggraph presentations. So if you want to know more about that, definitely check that out. But for now, I'm just going to go through some of these parameters, really good control. Moving this bird with no joints. And there's a reason behind building a rig like that. But first, I just want to give you a quick example of how you could do something like this. So we have this bird, right? And I want to bend the wing. And this is the problem that we usually run into when trying to use deformers to make rigs. All right? Let me just make sure I have this angle like how I want it to. Like this. Stretch it. Nope, not like that. Apply it to my eagle. Make sure I erase all this stuff. And let's do this bend. See, this does not look good. And so you want to figure out a way to avoid that kind of crazy stuff using deformers. And what I discovered is that you could take a vertex map and paint on this bird and tell that deformer what you want it to affect. Now, for me, that was super helpful. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. So if I select a polygon, Command A to select all polygons, and I could do select and set vertex weight. This gives me a vertex map for my entire bird. Now, if I double click on this vertex map, turn up the strength, turn off visible only because I want to paint this entire wing, and let's increase the radius. Ooh, I could just paint. No, really just paint the parts that I want to select on my vertex map, which is solely this wing. Cool, nice and painted. So now, if I right-click on Cinema 4D tags, I can make something called a restriction tag. And this restriction tag tells this deformer only affect what we've painted. So now that I've dragged this restriction tag, it only bends the wing, exactly what I want, right? Very useful tip, generally just for doing these types of rigs. So jumping back to a bird rig, that's what I did. I did a vertex map for all the different parts of the body that I wanted to control. But the reason I used deformers is because I could take, the simulations that I did, and what I did, I baked those out as a limbics, just because we were using a render farm. So every simulation we did had to be baked in some way. And I also made the same deformers that I used to affect the bird, and again, linked it all up in Xpresso. So then I had a rig for the bird, and I had a rig for our baked simulations that were all being controlled by these deformers, which worked pretty well when we went into production. As you can tell, this is really, really heavy stuff, and we're going to be jumping in some heavier scenes, but I just kind of trying to build up the layers of understanding as we proceed. So let's actually pop open something that's a little bit closer to a final, and that kind of brings me to the take system, right? For anyone who's been using cinema and does not know what the take system is yet, boy oh boy, you're in for a treat. This project would have been pretty much impossible to do without it. And more or less what the take system allows you to do is create certain settings within one Cinema 4D file and be able to cycle through. I'm going to show you what I mean. So, this bird is made out of several layers. So in this one Cinema 4D file, I could have a noise layer, right? My bird has a noise texture. And then, I wanted the next texture to render. This is a different specular. Let me just turn off my camera really quickly and also turn off these particles, these baked particles, so everything's nice and clean. Make sure it's turned off in our main take. So yeah, this is our bird, right? And what the take system allows me to do, I could switch between materials, different things. Like I could add the lines into a different pass. So it's almost like you're doing different passes within your own Cinema 4D file. And I'm going to kind of show you just at least how many renders this one scene had. So this one scene probably took, I jump into passes, right? You can see how many different things. And these are not passes that you just render and it's object buffers. No, this is I'm rendering this scene several times with different passes. And usually in the past, you would have to make a different Cinema 4D file for each one, but now you could do it all within Cinema. And at the end of the demo, I'll do a more in-depth look at takes. So, I'll just kind of do a quick run through. And then we had new compositors kind of putting all this stuff together. Particles. We had a bunch of different passes for this orb that was being used. Yeah, so, it just, the list goes on and on about the amount of things that had to be put together to really build a shot like this. Okay. So that's the flying bird. And just to recap, bird effects made mostly using Xparticles. Just full screen this for clarity. Then creating this bird rig. We're using deformers, which are being restricted using vertex maps, so we could kind of, really determine where we want to place, or what we could really define where we want our deformers to affect on the rig. Then we're connecting all these things to custom user data fields to have a really nice, clean rig. And then using the take system to organize these shots. Oh boy. This is where stuff started to get tricky. Shot number 2. That's when we really had to start using Xparticles in a way that, how should I say this? Xparticles, for me, sometimes is like a disobedient child. It just does not want to do what you want it to do. And we had to come up with some very innovative ways to kind of sim stuff to make it behave like we wanted it to. So we're simming these lines over this landscape. And, these lines had to go in really specific directions. For one, they had to contour with the landscape that we had. Then we had to have another simulation that went into very specific directions and then feel very natural at the same time. This shot actually gave me a lot of trouble to figure out, but we eventually kind of came up with a solution that I thought worked pretty well. So exits. So I just, talk about what we're trying to do, procedural way to get these lines to grow, and a flexible way to change and make these lines feel more organic. And the process we used is Xparticles to MoGraph. So what I would do an Xparticle simulation, and then bake that, and then use MoGraph on top of that to kind of define what I'm doing. So just so we get a clearer understanding of what that means, I'm going to jump into cinema. Because who doesn't love a little bit of cinema? So this is how it started, right? We had a nice Xparticle sim just running over this area. And how we did this, first and foremost, we had a couple modifiers. I'm not going to go too into detail, but more talk about the theory behind it. So we had a kind of follow surface modifier that told the particle stick to the surface as you're going over it. I'm just kind of, and then we had an attractor which is here, telling the particles that are emitted here to go towards this direction. All well and cool. And then there's this follow path modifier that tells the particles, well, firstly, let me explain to you the concept of the follow path. What the follow path modifier does is that it tells the particles to go into a specific spline shape. So in this instance, I had this object, and what this tells the emitter to do is to shoot these particles out and try to spread out to go to both corners of this sphere or this oval that I've created. So that's what this initial sim is doing. But, this isn't quite natural looking enough. The lines are pretty straight. Let me just get this to stay stationary here. The lines aren't pretty straight. This is not what we want. So what I had to do, and this is where MoGraph always saves me, what I had to do, if I go back into my generator, is where these lines are actually being created. And just do a quick resim. And you can see it just starts to chug, Cool. Let's do this. I should be able to bake that. Cool. So now we kind of have like these baked lines. And it gets really heavy really fast. If I were to go into point mode and select this, a crap ton of points. So let's just get rid of this landscape for 2 seconds. And then let's explain why we're baking this thing. So the whole reason we're baking this thing, right, is that now we have the ability to kind of shape this spline how we want. We could come in, select point mode, right-click, and we could select something called the magnet tool. And let's give this a really big radius. Really big radius. We could come in and I could start Let's select all these points. I could start moving points along and really start art directing how these lines go. And again, it's a little bit heavy to work with, but this is how we do it. So, that's the process, right? You kind of go in and you kind of take certain areas and you kind of bend it, you move it around, so until you get it to where you like. And once I've done that, I got a lovely bend that looks like this, something that to me felt a little bit more organic after I went and I made all these changes. But now we just have a spline, it's not animating anymore, right? MoGraph to save the day. So I'm just going to rebuild it so you can kind of see what we're doing from scratch. So I have my spline, or maybe I don't. Oh, yes we do. So I have my spline. And what I can do, I could create a matrix object and set this to object, and then put this spline in the object mode. And then off the bat, you're going to see that these matrices are cloned onto our spline. So if we jump, now MoGraph objects are very interesting when they're dealing with splines, because they give you a whole bunch of options that are not available with any other object. So let's turn off the end here. That brings all our points back. And let's turn off loop. And now, if I just set this offset, I have all these things moving along this spline. Super useful. I could art direct this how I want. I could add a nice variation so all the splines don't grow, from the tips. So I could turn this off, and then I could do MoGraph tracer object, and I could put my matrix object in here, and then I could simply animate my offset from here to here. Hit play. Bada bing. I have my lines growing in my new art-directed form. So now I could art direct this however I want, simply by just... So whatever I do to this one will then be updated in my rig. So very nice, flexible way of working with this type of landscape stuff. So that was how we did the landscapes. And now let's talk about the exits. Cool. These are our exits. As you can see, now we have 3 other different sims that I did. Let's just turn off this ground plane for a second. These are 3 different sims that I did. And it's all using similar techniques, right? They had to have a very kind of natural shape. And I used the same follow path to kind of get them to bend how I want them to, right? A tractor's at the end also to kind of direct it and tell it where it's going. And then, freeze to make it stop at the end. And then, of course, we had to bake this. I just baked this as an Xparticles sim. And then I kind of had to have these, if I go back to my, let's use a pre-show for now. If you look, there's these kind of energy lines that kind of run on top of them, right? So, I just used the same technique. I baked out each of these lines. If I turn off these generators. Where are they? Right? I baked out each of these lines that I have turned off. And then I used the same tracer objects and matrix objects, but now within our... Let me just make these invisible so we can really see what's going on. And now within our tracer, you could define the length of how far they run. Let me just turn off the landscape so we could just see, turn off the matrix objects, I mean. But now we have these little splines being created using that same technique. Again, plenty flexibility. All right, so that was the exits. That was shot 2. Shot number 3, that's when you have the guys rolling around the environment. And now we had to simulate lines over vast landscapes. And, again, I needed a flexible way to make them feel more organic. And we had to make these suspicious characters be able to animate over these mountains. No more Xparticles. At this point, I was like, to do that with Xparticles would be nuts. And we needed to figure out another way how to do this. So that's, again, where the matrix object came in handy. Now let's bring up the shot so we get a better look at it. So yeah, you can see there's a lot of lines and a lot of landscape to cover. And keep in mind, these are all splines with several thousands, millions of points on them. So a lot to, it would be too much to simulate, in my opinion, and it wouldn't be fast enough to get the kind of feedback that we wanted. So firstly, let's talk about how we would do something like this on a landscape like this. So my buddy Jason Diaz, he was also working on the project. He had this idea, well, maybe we could extract the edges from this landscape and do something like that. I was like, that's a good idea. But then we could add on the matrix object to it, and that's kind of what we did. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. Okay, so firstly, I needed to add more subdivisions. So I put it in a subdivision surface, add more subdivisions, we get this shape. Now I want to extract just these lines going this way, all the lines going this way on our thing. So what we do first and foremost, let's select all our edges, go to Mesh, Command, and Edge to Spline. That's gonna, did it instantly. So what that does, I now have my entire mesh as a spline. Very useful. So now what I can do, if I switch to my top view, full screen this, I can go to point mode, zoom in. I can now select all the points along this edge, like so. I think I got them all, or most of them. And now there's another tip that Jason discovered. If you hit UW, it does something called select connected. So what that does, if a point is here, it's going to select all the points in that direction. So now I've kind of isolated particular points. So we want the points going this way. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit UI to invert that selection and hit delete. Wait, I actually wanted the points going this way. So let me back up and just make sure I explain clearly what I did. So because we want the lines going this way, and these are the lines I currently just selected, we want to delete the other lines in the opposite direction. So then we hit UI to invert our selection, then we hit delete. So now we only have lines going in this direction, and that's the first step. But if we go in close in, right, as close as we were to the shot that we looked at, which is this, we definitely need more fidelity, and we need a denser mesh. So, and that's where MoGraph again really came in handy, because I could use this similar technique of creating a matrix object. And I could go to objects, I could go to matrix objects, turn into object mode, and I put my spline in there. And again, it's automatically just going to put a bunch of clones on the spline. So what we want to do is just shrink back our endpoints back to this point and turn off our loop. You're always going to get some random weird dude doing something, forgets about him. He's not important. So, and if I turn off this spline, I can animate this offset again. From here, over the course of 90 frames, there's this point, and we have automatically rebuilt, let's make our tracer object, of course. Make sure that's not a tracer object. MoGraph tracer. Delete this small spline, let's drop this matrix in here. Perfect. Right, so now we are recreating our landscape. Awesome, but again, no fidelity, right? But we're using MoGraph. A MoGraph can talk to effectors, which is dope. So now if I made a random effector, and let's just turn off some of these. And if I offset it a little slightly on the x-axis, or probably not the x-axis, this is not the x-axis, it's probably the z-axis. Let's try that one. Nope, so it has to be the y. There we go. Now, because we've offset it on that x-axis, we've now filled out some of these lines. So this is with the effector applied. This is with the effector not applied. Significant difference, right? Look how fast we did that. No type of simulation, nothing like that. And again, you know, there's a flexibility involved because right now we have a really sharp edge when it's growing. I could turn back on my random effector. I could then jump into my matrix, and I could have a nice little offset variation. Let's just hide this matrix object for the time being and just watch these lines grow. You get a nice offset on the edge, feels really natural. We get a nice dense mesh that we could then do the same thing where we rendered with hair. Rendered super fast, looks really good. Now, sometimes you run into an error when it goes over hills. And again, this could get really heavy really quick. Right now, our tracer is set to linear and none. If I change this to Bezier and uniform, you're going to get nice smooth lines, but it's going to crash. It's going to be very heavy to deal with. So it's always like a fight between that. So you won't even play back. So, you know, you tend to animate with this on, but you have to keep in mind you can only offset it so much. And that's why for the final, I had to use a decently dense mesh to kind of do this and still offset it to get the fidelity that I wanted when I was creating this landscape and make it look, you know, just nice and full. And yeah, you know, again, when I had those lines, similar technique for the energy lines, you had to clone particles onto these lines. Again, this is something that's composed of several layers upon layers. Take System, again, coming in and saving our lives. Now, this is the big boy. This one was a testament to the Take System. And I'm just going to open up this project so you can have an idea of what I mean. So this is one of the first R&D things I did for this tree shot. It's a combination of Xparticles, Turbulence FD. You know, you're using a lot of stuff. And as I always say with compositing, it's always a combination of subtleties. This is the actual shot from the piece. You know, there's a lot of these trees. Keeping in mind, this is all splines, all particles. And, you know, just a lot to deal with. So, and this is all built in one scene. How do we go about doing this? So firstly, you know, I isolated a scene where I created just a line sim, and I'm not going to go too much into detail about that. This is just the baked version as an alembic. Oh, this is the actual tree itself. And again, we were using a render farm, so we had to bake everything because when you're doing these type of procedural things in a render farm, everything needs to be baked. Because if different computers are calculating things at different times, it's not going to look right. This is another sim, not the one I quite want. This is the one I want. Cool. And this is like our baked tree animation. You can see it's kind of growing and taking this over. You could find a bunch of tutorials and stuff that kind of gives you an idea of how to do this. But in a nutshell, it's Xparticles, attractors, and follow surface. And you kind of let it do its thing. So after I had a good idea of, you know, my tree is looking kind of good, let's jump into our main scene. And let's make sure we're opening this with R17 that has Xparticles. It's a little heavy file, so it's going to take a little while to open. And what I really want to talk about here is how do you manage a scene that has so many things going on, right? it's a combination of layers and takes. Now this is the amount of takes I had to have to render all the layers I needed for this piece. Let's turn on these lines. Right. Let's just make sure all our alembics are connected. Ooh, not good. What's the best way of doing this? Let me just reconnect these alembics quite quickly. Line 2, just give them all the same name. They just need to be local. If I can't get these to relink, that would be quite unfortunate. All right. Tree 6. So all I have to do is select them all, put the correct file name in. All should be relinked. Do the same thing with lines 1. Relink them all. And again, when you're dealing with this type of production, file naming, file organization, where you're putting stuff is superbly important. All right, and just want to make sure that my lines are showing up. Oh, okay, I see what I did there. You see, what I just did, which is a good example of takes, I made the change within that take. So, yeah, it's only going to be in that take. So I need to come up in my main, and then I need to make all those changes, and then it's going to apply to all the different takes. So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. Let's reconnect that. Good to go. Reconnect lines 1. Good to go, and that's been done in my main. So we're seeing all our lines pop up again. That's great. And now we can kind of look through our takes and see what's going on, right? So I had a take just for one color of lines. What I would do, I would use a combination of layers and takes to get my stuff organized. So for example, I have all my lines and all the things I need in particular layers. And say, for example, for this tree green take, I only want my lines and I only want my trees. And within a take, you could turn on layers on and off. So that means within this tree, I could just basically tell Cinema what I wanted to see. And just by cycling through that, I kept my file really organized, and it was so much easier to manage how I'm doing this process. And again, I could cycle through a bunch of these. This is the blue trees. They had their own lines, tree energy. And I'm just going to cycle through all these passes because there were quite a lot. And again, this is 400 frame shots rendered at 4K being rendered 12 times. So do the math to figure out how much rendering you have to do per pass to do a comp of this. So anytime I made a mistake, a lot of rendering to do. I know hats off to the compositors because they had to take all this stuff and put it together. Chris Russo, who comped this shot, I think he did a fabulous job. So all these passes were part of that process of kind of, building this tree shot. So we have 3 minutes left. Let's do a quick take system demo. Really simple. Right? Let me just show you how useful this thing is. We have 3 different shapes. Let's give each one a different material. I'm going to make this one red. We're going to make this one more blue. Let's make this one green. Right? Now say I wanted my cube, but I wanted it green. But I didn't want to make another C40 file. That's no problem. We want to turn on our automatic mode. And let's make a new take. Let's call this green cube. And now if I go into my objects, anything I do now will be saved in that take. So I'm going to turn off this sphere and this tube, and I could change my red material to green. And what I need to do, I need to just open up my attributes, Once you see things that are highlighted in blue, that means that they can be changed and saved in the take. And once you make a change, like I'm going to change this to green, it's going to not be selected. So that's how you know a change has been made. So now I could go back into my main, and I have everything just as I left it. I go back into my take, I have that other option. And you could just do this in the same file and just make all these different variations using takes, which is, for large productions, the most significant update I think cinema's had in a while. And again, doing that Dolby project without this, I can't stress how incredibly difficult this would have been. So let's just do a couple combinations, you know, just to see how flexible the system is. I want just my blue, right? And I already made a new take. Let's call this red ball. Red ball, take off this tube, put a red. So now I could cycle through my takes. I have my green cube, my red ball, and I still have my main take. But now, if I want to just switch these positions, if you want to make a change up here, it's going to cycle through and change the placement down the order. Makes it even more powerful. Because then I could just work here, do what I have to do, and I'm ready to render. All my render passes is already set up, and you're just good to go. And it's a great way of working. Super powerful. Yeah, my name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a designer, animator at Imaginary Forces. This was the Dolby Pre-Show. And yeah, this is my contact. Hit me up, email, sekanimd@gmail.com. Visit my website, sekanimotiondesign.com. Hit me up on Vimeo or at, that is not my Instagram. Just imagine that an M was in here, Solomon, and not Saloon. That sounds weird. Yeah, so hit me up. Thanks, guys, for listening. Appreciate it.